Friday I learned that I am one of God's favorite Valentines. Apparently, God made all our noggins, but the noggins that God wants to see daily, He removes the hair. Which I translate to mean, I am now one of God's favorite. So, after the first service, I was mentioning to someone that for some reason my barber doesn't reduce the price, even though I have less hair to cut. He said that's because they're now charging you a finder fee for the hair. Not encourage you to go bald, but God does like some noggins. So some fun facts for Valentine's Day. I hope you had a good Valentine's Day. Longest official marriage, 86 years, 290 days. I know that's a goal to go for, but for Herbert and Zelmira Fisher, they celebrated 86 years and 290 days of marriage before Mr. Fisher passed away. Pets, did you spend some money on your pets? Well, apparently we spent over $700 million on our pets for Valentine's Day. It's kind of shocking. It's just a drop in the bucket, though. Apparently we spent almost $19 billion on each other. I don't know if one of you personally ever wrote all that, but I hope your Valentine's was good either way. So I was going to do the State of the Church sermon. You saw that in the bulletin. For lots of reasons, I decided to go back to my original idea, was to leverage the holiday and talk about relationships. It just made more sense in the end. So we're going to talk about relationships, and partly because all of our relationships are intended to be a love relationship of some kind. Whether it's a romantic love, a familial love, or your God-called to love the stranger in your midst kind of love. Hopefully all of our relationships in some way are in love relationships. So I want to talk about today some of the ways in which we make these the best of our relationships and what we can do to help that. I was going to bring Dr. Phil in. He's kind of aggressive, so we'll leave him out. Instead, we'll look at the 3 C's of this. The first is choice. So I've done this talk a lot with high school kids, and I always try to impress upon them the power of choice. You know, usually myself, when I've gotten in trouble in friend relationships is when, instead of making that choice up front, I put a higher value on being liked, fitting in. And it's amazing how much those kinds of pressures can carry us away to places that are not helpful. Sometimes we find ourselves running with friends that are fantastic fun to be with, but they tend to be the ones that get us dirty because we run in the gutter together and have a great time, but it's always a mess at the end. If we make a choice, the consequence is always so much better. Sometimes it's not even the choice about who the person is, because we're all called to be in a relationship, a love relationship with all of God's children. So it may not necessarily be the choice of who this person is that we're in a relationship with, but what's my participation? What am I willing to do? What are my hopes and dreams for this relationship? When we choose those up front, the rest of the ride is vastly different. Even if you're thinking about meeting the neighbor that just moved into the house next door, if you were to pause a moment and think about what your hopes and dreams are for your relationship with this new neighbor, before you go greet them and introduce yourself, it will be a different conversation. And it can be a different kind of relationship. I don't know if you use Zillow. Somewhere along the way, apparently, I created an account on Zillow looking for a house. So I get almost daily updates on places where Zillow thinks I should live. And at first I was very perplexed because Zillow, in all their wisdom, they wanted me to look at houses that range from $100,000 to like $750,000 on the same day. Why did they think that that was where I should be looking? I never made a choice. Apparently I filled out my account, never filled in my choices on what I'm looking at, so they just gave me everything. You have hopes and dreams for your relationships. They never get realized unless we choose them, unless we work for them, unless we strive for those. When our relationships start haphazardly, they end hazardly. Is that right? Sounded a little good in my head. always sounded great when it came out. So choice is one. What we choose up front is definitely going to affect what's at the end. But even more so if we can communicate that. If the person I'm with is someone I cannot communicate with, what kind of relationship should I allow myself to have with them? And that's not to cast aspersion on them necessarily, but if this is simply a person that we don't hear each other well, I'm afraid to say things to them, or I find myself saying things that I regret later, what does that say about that relationship? I can make wonderful choices, but if I can't communicate them to this person that I'm in a relationship with, how does that impact the relationship? And that's whether we're talking about our business relationships, our neighborly relationships, but especially when we're talking about the person we're hoping to spend a lifetime with. One of my favorite illustrations of this is an elderly couple. They've been married only 50 years, not quite 86 years and 290 days. Came home from their weekly shopping trip, and per their routine that they had done every week for 50 years, the husband went into the kitchen to make lunch. He pulled out the entire loaf of bread from the sack, took the 2 heels off, made a wonderful sandwich for his wife, then took 2 regular slices and made his own sandwich and carried them to the table. Apparently 50 years of doing this every week was just the straw that broke the camel's back, because the wife exploded when the sandwich was presented to her. On she ranted, "I hate heel sandwiches. You have been giving me heel sandwiches for 50 years and I hate them. Would you please quit giving me the heel sandwiches?" He wilted. He wilted and he said, "I've been giving you heel sandwiches for 50 years because to me that's the best part of the whole loaf." Yeah. If they had communicated, she would have had 50 years of amazing sandwiches that she would have loved. If it could impact so simple as that, how can that be impactful on our relationships when it comes to things that are even more important? Our values, our boundaries, our hopes and dreams, what's allowed and what's not allowed. When we communicate that, we not only communicate what we're willing and not willing to put into a relationship, but we're affirming the other person. You take the guesswork out of a relationship. How many times do we assume the other person's going to read our mind? Even after 50 years of sharing lunch together every week, we assume they'll read our mind. Why don't you just know that that's what I want? Because you never said. When I give this talk to high schoolers, I usually crack a joke about relationships are always better in 3s, but after a children's sermon today, I don't know if I can. The children's sermon, I think, had to have a rating. No, it's not teasing you, Shelley. Keep it classy. Keep it classy. If we can have our relationships in front of God, they're always better for us. Always better. If we can have our relationships with God, they're always better for us. And not just because maybe this person that I'm hanging around is not someone that I'm comfortable to hang around in front of God. Maybe that's the case. But how often is it simply because we are now denying ourselves the opportunity of Christ's love inside the relationship? Including Christ in all of our love relationships is not about judging the other person as much as it is about affording us this eternal resource of love. Usually when we read the 23rd Psalm, we're reading it thinking about those enemies in our life. Death, someone who's oppressing us, whoever the enemy is. So we read that section, the Lord set a table before my enemies, where my cup overflows. Sometimes that enemy is in our house, right? Sometimes the person we're having the most passionate relationship with can be the person with whom we have the most passionate discord. So what if we read Psalm 23, and now the table that's set before us is not simply so that God is protecting us from the enemy, but now not, it's a table like the one we celebrate every Sunday morning. It's a table where reconciliation can happen. That's a whole different light on how we read the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He sets a table before my enemies. That's a table where we can find a reconciliation that we ourselves cannot provide. That's a table where we can celebrate a type of forgiveness and acceptance, intimacy and vulnerability that we of our own doing cannot create. When we live our relationships by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, we completely deny ourselves the opportunity of something that makes our love more amazing, more lasting, more enduring, a place where our hopes and dreams can come true, a place where our hopes and dreams can thrive, a place where now this relationship is not simply some place where we're business partners in life or we're neighbors next to each other because that's the geography of the situation, but now this is a relationship where we can find the witness of God's love among us. A place where we can see God witnessing to us through the way we share our daily interactions, good, bad, or otherwise. With the promises we make, either in a wedding or in that first handshake when you meet your neighbor next door, you have the opportunity to live those out. Relationships are an opportunity. When we're intentional with our choices and our communicating and before whom we live them, they can be amazing things. You are God's Valentine, God's favorite. And so is our neighbor.